Do you believe art can change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. Right now, there's a cruel and draconian practice of detaining and separating migrant families at the border. It's difficult to imagine for most of us. We all think we understand why families might take this risk, leaving behind places where they're threatened with violence or an inability to grow enough food or make enough money to support themselves. But is this risky journey to the United States only about what these families are fleeing? What comes next for these families? I always wonder, how are these traumatic experiences processed by the parents who underwent this? And how are they processed by their children? There's a new book that answers some of these questions. Gabrielle Oliveira is Jorge Paulo Lemann Associate Professor of Education and Brazil Studies at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Through the creation of relationships with families and educators, Gabrielle established the trust needed for teachers, parents, and especially children dealing with the aftermath of the trauma at the border to share their stories with her. Her research led her to write the book, Now We Are Here: Family Migration, Children's Education, and Dreams for a Better Life. What Gabrielle discovered was that for the parents who chose to undertake migration to the United States, although obviously there were harsh conditions that influenced their decisions, these journeys were also motivated by a desire for their children to receive an education. Afterwards, grappling with feelings of doubt and guilt about what their children went through, the parents of these families hold onto the hope and faith that their children will be educated and have better lives than was possible in their home countries, better lives than they'd had. The children of these families are still processing trauma in situations at home and at school, where educators puzzle over the best way to help them, while also caring for all the children in their community. The questions posed by Gabrielle in this book are complex, and the answers are surprising. Most of all, Gabrielle wonders, what would all of this look like, immigration and education, if we could just put children first? Not only the children of migrant families, but all children. How might our society look? You want to know how you can really help me keep this show going? Follow me on your favorite listening app. So easy, right? And if you really want to give the show a boost, leave me a 5-star rating or review. Hi, Gabrielle. Thank you so much for being on Art Heals All Wounds. I am really, really looking forward to talking to you today about your latest book. Can you say a little bit about your book? What is the title and what is it about?
Yes, no, it's so nice to be here with you. Thank you for having me. The title of my book is Now We're Here: Family Migration, Children's Education, and Dreams for a Better Life. And the book documents the lives of 16 families that came from Central and South America to the United States and experienced detention and separation, often at the border back in 2018, 2019. And then I'm looking at how They basically make a life for themselves after they're reunified, and the role that education and schooling plays as a stabilizer and as a concept that holds hope for families as they build their lives in the United States.
Yes, and there were a lot of things that I appreciated about this book, but one thing I want to talk about before we really get into the content of it, well, this was the content. You really explain your approach to research. And, I make documentary films, and I really appreciated you talking about different ways to approach research as opposed to people feeling like research is being done on them to being with them and for them. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think whenever I teach, I think a lot about folks that do documentaries because in many ways you're figuring out how to tell a story. I imagine you have a ton of footage, but then you're selecting what you're going to use and the angle you're going to take, but you're trying to stay close and honest and authentic to what happened, right? But we all have a point of view. There's no escaping that. And I think in research in my area, has been dominated by this idea that there is this clear, objective type of, research that you can be outside and just relay the facts with nothing that it would influence you. And I don't buy it, as a way to do work because we're human beings, right? And things will move us more or move us less. And I think the way that I thought about doing this work I've always tried to be really close to who I am without trying to mask it or pretend that I am just an objective witness that I don't have skin in the game where I feel like I do. I do because these are people that are letting me be with them. I have the privilege to be close to these families and to tell parts of their stories, right? They're trusting me. So I think with that comes a lot of responsibility. And I often feel that in my field, in academia and in the social sciences, sometimes there's this idea that, the rigorous books are the ones that people are claiming to have this distance and objectivity towards it, where I think that you got to come from respect and reciprocity as you establish these relationships.
Well, I appreciate you saying that so much. I think this idea of objectivity can really keep us stuck in that we don't really think about who was doing this research, what their objective was. And the other thing I think that you're saying, which is so important, is that establishing trust is really your most valuable asset. And you talked about respect. And I think a lot of people know when you're approaching them with respect as opposed to when you're not.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I am Brazilian. I'm an immigrant, right? Myself. I've been in the US for almost 20 years. And I talk a little bit about this in the book about how it feels to always feel like you are in between, right? Between spaces, your identity and who you are. But it's really important to understand how people perceive you as well, right? So I can tell you all day long who I think I am, but then folks can say who they think I am, right? And I think when being this research, when folks would consider me either a friend that was visiting or often a researcher or a social worker or a teacher or a therapist or somebody with resources that could guide them to where to get a lawyer or advocate for their kids in school. So those roles keep shifting in a way that feels true to life because we're never just one thing. So I think one of the main things that I try to do in my work is also time. So to be in the lives of these families for, 3 years where you can actually build that trust and that respect that you're mentioning, which doesn't come, it's not in 24 hours. They say, do you want to be part of this research? And can I just start coming to your home? And calling you and talking to you, it's also this idea of how they perceive you and how they think you can also bring something to their lives and that reciprocity.
Mm. Well, I'm curious to know, when did you first have the idea for this research and then this book? And I'm also curious to know, what surprised you, and did your focus ever shift based on what you were learning?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. In my first book, I wrote about Mexican mothers who had left their children in Mexico and migrated to New York City, but continued to parent across borders. And for me, it was really important to kind of tell the story of these women who are doing such incredible sacrifices, but could be easily painted as the women that quote unquote left their children, but they're actually caring for them, right? Their migration is to care for their kids. So that was my first project. And at the time that I thought about, this second book, I was working in a school district here in Massachusetts, and I was very much in schools and looking at how teachers were engaging with young students that came from different backgrounds. And I started interviewing families who would offer this information. Oh, when I was at the border, this happened to me. I was detained, my kids were taken from me, or we had to wait in Mexico for 6 months, and they kept going back to the experience at the border. And I just kept thinking, okay, there's something here obviously that really shaped how they're thinking about their future. They're thinking about their fears, how they're thinking about their, lives now in the United States. And I kept going back to that. But what was different for me was that usually in my research, I work with one nationality at a time, right, per se. So, Mexican population in New York City or Brazilians here in Massachusetts. And in this time around, it was about the experience at the border, regardless of your nationality. And I think that for me was a pivot and it was a change from how I usually try to understand because I really focus on the preconditions, right? So, why would people from Brazil start leaving so much? So, I want to dedicate a lot of my time to understanding that context specifically. But in this case, everybody kept going back to this unifying, traumatic, complicated experience at the border. And this policy really impacted the lives of these children and families long term. So for me, it was really important to kind of center the beginning of the project to be about that moment of what happened at the border.
Right. Well, I want to talk about that more because it's been an appalling policy, um, you know, that happened and that is now back, or the immigration policy is like viciously, horribly worse even than it was in 2018 and 2019. But before we do, I just want to tell you what your book highlighted that surprised me. And you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, that this is not what you meant to say. But when I think of migration, I think of people who are fleeing something, which all of these families were in different ways. Violence, exploitation, sometimes, you don't talk about this that much, but really climate is having a huge effect on migration and political realities at home. And so there is that element. But the other thing that was so interesting to me is how this idea of an American education really, really was the other thing driving migration. And I think for me, I've never thought about, well, why? I've never thought about what might be the prize. I've always thought of education sort of as just an effect of being here now, but not that it would be such a draw. Am I understanding what you found correctly?
Yes, yes, no, absolutely. And it's so I love hearing, how people make sense because you never know. You're writing and you're hoping that people are making sense, but the different interpretations are also really helpful. Because one of the things that for me was important to think about is that in immigration in general, in research, but also how the media usually covers immigration, we get kind of this dichotomous story, right? Like this successful immigrant that, through everything ended up starting their own business or was the best at school and did everything right and becomes this kind of, model of what an immigrant is. Or you get the other story, which is the suffering subject, right? The one that is escaping all the poverty and the violence and corruption and climate change and persecution and wars and starvation, you name it. So you get that suffering subject, right? And I think for me was really important to go beyond those two pieces and to think about, these folks as people that are looking to live a dignified life and a life that in the end of the book, I call an ordinary life, which is a positive thing, right? Sometimes this idea of the extraordinary is what everybody is looking for, but most people want to be able to live in a safe place, send their kids to school, have enough money and time to have leisure in their lives and to spend time with people that they love, right? It's not rocket science, right? In that sense. And I think the more I did this research, and I was sure to get all the stories of the suffering and the winning, right, part, like the victory and all of that. But for me, it was really important to hear a little bit more deeper in terms of what are the things that you want. If all this stuff you already told me, we get it, right? But what are the things that you as a human are thinking about and you're entitled to? And an education and a good education is key in how people are trying to think about a better life for their children, right? But I often think that sometimes media and the reports would just don't make room
Mm.
for people to talk about some of these things that maybe for you and me could be a mundane, everyday, right? Like as a mom myself, there's nothing more that I want for my kids to have a good, strong education, be healthy, and have a future, right, for themselves. But for the immigrant population that's coming, we tend to put them in a box of kind of, they're here because of all the tragedy, and that's the narrative.
Right. And I think one of the reasons that strikes me that this is important is that that particular victim suffering narrative really places them squarely as a population who's purely just needy,
Hmm.
as opposed to a population that is here to make something of themselves and
Hmm.
that could be a strong contributor to our everyday fabric of life. Their children are well educated, they're working individuals, whether that means just a job that they get or starting a business, um, or, and then perhaps with the education they get, their children will go a further step up this so called ladder of success. And I think that that's a really important distinction. It's not just people, whether they're, applying for asylum or not, they're not just here saying, oh, help us, help us, help us. They are willing to become engaged and do the work. And
Absolutely.
I think that that's really a very important distinction. And I do want to go back, though, to talking about this trauma that the families experienced. And it seems like, there's sort of three different groups who are
Mm.
dealing with this trauma. There are the parents, there are the teachers, and then there are the children. And there were very remarkable differences between how each group either felt about this trauma or reacted to it or expressed it or tried to control it. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what you found.
So just,
especially vis-a-vis the children. That's what
yeah.
I'm interested in.
And I love your analysis. It's so spot on in terms of even, I'm going to borrow from you just how, the different groups. And I think one of the things for me is really important was exactly what you described was to have parents' perspectives, children's perspectives, and educators, right, in that together just to show, right, the multi-dimension. And I think for me, my deepest passion in the way that I do research is definitely engaging with children because in many ways it is, even as I teach at a university and I teach research methods, and a lot of my students end up not doing work with children because it just there's more there are more barriers that you have to go through, right? In terms of getting permission, getting consent, getting assent, getting all of that stuff to involve minors in research. And then some people are kind of saying, well, it's too many burdens. So I'm just going to stay with what the adult says about the child, right?
Mm.
And we lose so much in that, right? Because as a society, we all function with this arc, which is an adult arc, right? Beginning, middle, and end. When we do an interview, when we talk to people, when we read a book, we expect this kind of organized narrative to convey a message. But then when children are talking to you, their narratives are all over the place, right? And they're mixing the fantastical with the real, with what matters for them, with they're spontaneous about when they bring things to the table. So focusing on the kids as, people with fully formed thoughts and taking what they were saying face value without going around and saying, is it true? Is it real? Right? For me was a really big piece of this work to engage with them in this way. And that means that you're around children a lot and you're not prompting a lot. You're not asking questions. You're letting them bring up things in their own time, which demands a lot of time, right? For you, it's different if I run an interview with an educator or a parent. I could do a 3 hour oral history, about whatever happened. But with a child, it would take me months, right, to kind of piece it together because it's in their own time of what they're talking about. So I think for me, that was a key piece to bring the perspectives of children, but in their own words and narratives without trying to make it sound like what an adult would expect.
Right. And one thing that I found fascinating, well, I know you talk a lot about the parents' sort of feelings of guilt that their children had to experience that trauma. Um, but one thing I found fascinating about the kids is that you never really knew what particular activity in school would prompt their desire, I guess, or need to talk about this trauma. And they didn't necessarily speak about it in a dramatic way. It was in a very matter of fact way. One of the stories I love was the question about what will you choose for lunch today?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little about this one child, how that took him back to this moment of being in detention.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So for those of you who know about elementary education, right, in the United States at least, morning meeting is a big moment, right, in K through 5, where the kids are sitting usually on a rug, and the teacher is going to talk about the weather, the date, the plan for the day, and often the teacher will go around asking if the kids brought lunch from home or if they're going to buy lunch at school. So that was the beginning of, a Tuesday morning in this first grade classroom. And the teacher was going around asking, did you bring lunch from home or are you going to buy lunch from school? And the kids said, well, what's lunch at school, right? What's the option? What's the, as my child calls it, right? The main, what's the main lunch, or I would say the hot lunch. And the teacher says, oh, for today's fajitas. And then some of the kids are like, what is that? So she says, fajitas are this, and she describes what it is. And then first, a young girl, Flor, she blurts, out and says, oh, I know what that is. that is the food that they gave us when we were in that prison, right? And she just says that in that, going around in the circle, all the kids are there knee to knee, crisscross, applesauce, what everybody knows. And then she says, and it was frozen in the middle. So she's talking about burritos, which were, we know that in ICE detention centers and in immigration detention centers, they're distributed widely. And they are frozen and they're not often completely defrosted. So there are frozen parts in the middle. So she was talking about that. And then this other boy says, I know what you're saying. It happened to me too, right? This is something
Right.
that I also ate when I was in this prison. So they bond over that experience on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. when the teacher was just asking a very benign question, what are you going to eat for lunch? Which goes to show, I think two things. One thing, how salient that was and that continued to be for the kids, that was still top of mind, that it was very much part of their existence right at that moment, but also to the teachers, side, the trust that these kids felt that they could blurt that out, regardless of what happened after, right? But they felt that they could say that in the classroom.
Right. And gosh, so many things are like in my mind right now. Not only just the trust, but whether it's trauma or not, the experience and knowledge that these two children wanted to share.
Mm-hmm.
That this particular type of food, whether it's a burrito or fajitas, was not unknown to them because they had this certain life experience that other kids in the classroom did not have. And I feel like, on the one hand, I feel like it would be so beautiful just for there to be this openness where kids who have gone through that type of trauma or any other type of trauma that comes to their mind at any point in the school day, it would just be open to talk about it. But on the other hand, I also understand what might be going through the mind of the teacher, particularly right now. There's this sense of not wanting to necessarily out your student as a recent migrant, I suppose would be the right word, but there's probably a lot of fear
Mm-hmm.
in teachers' minds that they don't want this other child in the classroom innocently going home and saying, oh, so and so, went through a detention center coming into the United States. And so I can imagine that. But you also talk about this concept of time and compartmentalizing things in a way that just doesn't really work with children, which is that that's the past
Mm-hmm.
and it's not here anymore. And this is the present, and then the future is going to be great, hopeful. And that's not really how trauma works.
Right.
Trauma doesn't just like, oh, that's the past. Oh,
That's the
well.
best. Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think and the teachers, to your point, I think a lot of what they were trying to be protective of the kids and kind of saying, well, you're okay. Now you're here and you're safe. You're safe here now. Everything's going to be fine because they were very nervous about kids staying in that trauma because for them, right, that was in the past. Don't relive the past. Let's forge a better future in that way. But for children, it just percolated. It came at different times and it appeared in their minds at different times. And maybe something triggered. Maybe they just wanted to share, right? Again, if you have been in a classroom with 5 and 6 year olds, they'll say the most random things. And, elementary school teachers are just, bless their hearts because they just take on sometimes the kids are offering an entire family gossip about my uncle did this and then this happened and the teacher's like okay let's that's their business but so that that's also part of a 5 and a 6 year old behavior anyway but a lot of what these teachers were trying to do is put a lid on it So in their mind, it wouldn't re-traumatize the child, but also exactly what you explained, which is it would make other kids nervous.
Mm.
So in their minds, they're thinking, well, what if this other kid goes home and tells their parents, oh, I was in class today and such said that they were in a detention center. And then what if this parent calls the school and says, what are you guys talking about in a kindergarten classroom? Prison? Which I'm not opposed. I think we should, and it's okay. And there are ways, but there are ideas about children, about like what they can and cannot be engaged with. And I always think about, children of color, they grow up already with parents telling them, if you encounter law enforcement, these are the things you have to do. This is how you got to, behave and all of that. So 3-year-olds are already hearing a lot of that, for kids of color. But then a lot of the white kids and white parents feel very protective that their kids shouldn't be hearing some of these things that may be more traumatizing. But why is that 3-year-old child of color okay to hear about that and the other one is not, right? So I think it's also a piece on equity of trying to think about, if we're really trying to think about allyship and what it means to coexist in a community and be there for one another, there are ways to engage, children together. But the teachers are just thinking, I got to get to math and I got to do my first reading lesson, right? I don't have time to do a social justice lesson at this point, and because I haven't been trained for this, I don't know enough. I'm nervous about not doing all the lessons that I have to because my principal's going to come knock on my door and say, what are you doing? Why are you not teaching, quote unquote? So there are a lot of pressures on the teachers. And I think, as a society, we often expect teachers to fix everything, and they can't, and they
Right.
shouldn't.
Right, right. That's such a great point. I mean, I just remember too, when my children were young, they will come home with stories that are completely out of context. And my kids at least had a way of presenting this information as the most, like, for me as a parent, thinking like, what? What do you mean that this happened? And I was that parent who would, get in touch with the teacher and say, you know, my child said this was said or happened. And then the teacher would say, yes, and here's the context. So
Mm-hmm.
I I completely get it and I teach at a university level. It's very different, but there's often trauma in those classrooms too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the difference is that you're dealing with adults and that you could either in an office hours or something
Mm-hmm.
like that explore this in a way that's not all in the classroom, that is not available to elementary school teachers. Yeah. But I do wonder, my question for you was, if you had to imagine school that was what you just said, which I thought was really nicely said, was more equity based. Could you imagine another way of helping children who had gone through such a traumatic event feel like they could not have to box all of that up or be redirected in the classroom?
Right. And one of the things that I think could be different, and I think there are many teachers doing this, and I have some great, friends who were in my research project and now become friends because I'm just such a fan of everything that they do, and just their hearts are in the right place, right, to do that. But one of the things that I try to always talk to the teachers and the trainings and everything is to bring together the assignments for the lesson closer to what the kids are trying to express about themselves and their stories. And simple ways of doing that is, a simple way is, writing about it, drawing about it, telling a story about it, and allowing for that, right, to happen. And we did a lot of that in the classrooms. And I would, I'd pose a simple prompt for the kids in the classroom and say, draw your home and label it, right, and then in that drawing, so many things would come up. And one of the kids in the research drew the border, right? The US-Mexico border. And so with that, that is an artifact that for the teacher could open up a conversation with the child, but the school psychologist can also, because the child already produced an artifact that can be used. It's not even that we're creating assumptions, that we're trying to figure out, is this child want to talk about this or not? But the child offered it. So when somebody offers you a piece of their vulnerable selves and the other part doesn't follow through, just think about how we all feel, right? If you're making a new friend and you say something that you feel like is very vulnerable and they're like, oh, okay, thanks for sharing. They move on with, you're kind of like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that. This was not the right venue. You're overthinking, So it's bringing closer to literacy. So let's think about a writing project, right? Let's think about how we're going to sound out the letters based on what they wrote in this drawing. So you bring what children are trying to share closer to the standards that you're trying to teach, right? So we try to do a lot of that to make the lives of teachers a lot easier. Choose a book for the morning meeting to read about that discusses some topics so that children can think to themselves, I feel seen. This is a part of me. I'm part of this, right? So you can do a lot of that. But obviously my biggest dream would be to reinvent everything that we know, especially about elementary education, and for that to be a lot closer to early education, center-based education where there's more play and there's more drama in terms of theater and reenacting and just more words being expressed as opposed to filling out sheets, with additions and letter sounds and all of that, which I know we got to do it. So I feel like I'm stuck in between my pragmatic self, which is when I'm with my teachers, I'm always trying to think, how do I make your jobs easier for you? And how do we bring what we know from these findings into your classroom, which is what I call the wiggle room? How much wiggle room do we have today, right? Can we do an activity that feels a little bit more loose, that is not as, tightly wired to this particular standard? So I have all of that in the toolbox. And then my idealistic self is thinking, they should be playing and building and imagining, because then you're going to let a lot more of that come to the classroom and you wouldn't even shock you, because there'd be so many moments that the kids would talk about that for this teacher that was going around about what they ate, she's like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? If everybody's playing and have more of that flexibility, you would get more content from the kids, which would increase how fast you get to know them. And then you can tailor assignments and learning closer to their needs, right? But a teacher on their own can't do that. It has to be a complete systems change.
Right. Well,
That was like a big.
No, but being the age that I am, I mean, I went to school for most of my life, K through 12, in Arkansas, which was considered a very, very poor, it was a poor state, and poor education. But I value it so much compared to the early education that my children got in California. The idea of doing a worksheet when my kids first hit even kindergarten, I was appalled that first of all they had homework. Second of all, that they were expected to read and write by the end of kindergarten. It's like, that's insane. And then the lack of play.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of play, the lack of art, the lack of a lot of things that were so valuable for me, even in one of the poorest states in terms of at that time in education. And now being in one of the wealthiest states and just seeing the way that early childhood education is approached was appalling to me. It's like, why should my child come home and do an hour's worth of homework in first grade?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's because it's the idea of the repetition, and I think we're moving even more towards that with what we're seeing with the battle, for science of reading and all of that we're seeing. The pendulum keeps swinging, right? Like back and forth, and we lose sight of, Kids need to be outside, running, playing, building, talking, making friends. And then in the classroom with good, solid instruction hours where they're learning something else, implementing, try it out, making mistakes, right? So that's kind of where we should be thinking more about. And I think with what kids were saying in the classroom, every time I give a talk on the book and I give some of the examples of what the kids say, most people are so shocked. And I think because I've been doing this, for so long, I've come to expect their brilliance in the way they articulate. Because if you listen closely and if you allow for that time, you're going to get a lot of that. But if it's not, if it's always, a top down instruction, and then you're not going to get, that piece as much. And I think we're missing out. And it's not like our education system has improved in the last few decades. So it's not like we're doing something that's working.
Hmm. Well, the other thing I'm thinking as you're speaking is that I wish that the broader community of this particular school could all be brought into this, in terms of many people in that school would not have had that same experience of a migration that involved this trauma at the border. And it would be lovely for that to be a shared context
Mhm.
among the entire school community. But being a pessimist, I worry that that would not be possible right now. Um, I don't know. What do you? I have a question for you, which maybe could address that a little bit. Um, there's so much more in your book, and people should read it because I think it will be really, really very beneficial to our understanding of these families who have had to go through this. But if you had a wish, your wish list of two overlapping things, what people could take away from this book and how people would think about this issue in terms of equity, what would that wish be?
Yeah, I think for me is that from the book, I would say that I hope people would take away that if we all think about the well-being of children, which I think I want to believe, that regardless of which political view people hold or how they feel about, one thing or another, we can agree that children shouldn't suffer, shouldn't be away from their parents, shouldn't experience trauma, right? In this way that could be avoided. If we focus on the kids in that way, my wish is that people can come out of this and say, okay, all right, so let's make policy that doesn't hurt children. We can still make policy on immigration, obviously, because it's a sovereign state. I'm not going to argue with that. As much as, borders were drawn in a very artificial way through wars and occupation and taking things, they exist. And again, I'm a pragmatist. I know what a sovereign state is and everything. And so it's not a but, it's and what do we do if children's well being is at the top of our priority list? Would we still be implementing the policies that we're seeing happening? Would that still be the case? If you're thinking a 5-year-old shouldn't be afraid of going to school and coming home and not finding their mother, right? Uh, Teenagers shouldn't be wondering if they're going to become the head of the household now that both parents were detained and sent to a country that they don't even know where they are, right? That all of a sudden they're put into a high poverty state, whereas before they weren't. They had
Right.
income and they were able to study and make through, so we're so that's, I think, my wish for people reading the book is that what happens if we put kids first? Not saying immigrant kids, kids of color, Latino kids, children, because they're supposed to be all of our kids, right? So what happens if we do that? How can we make it different? The policies that we draw.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm hoping that your book is going to have a role in helping people to think about that. So thank you. I know it was so much work and so much research and so much time, but you write about it with such, such highly, highly valuable time that you spent. So thank you for doing this and for writing this book.
Well, thank you for reading. Thank you for having me. For me, I mentioned this before, it's hard to know how it will resonate. Unfortunately, even though I wrote about this from, previous policy, it applies now, how we're thinking about family separation and detention and all of that. So, unfortunately, still very relevant. I wish it wasn't.
Yes, it's very relevant. It's very timely. And I want you to share with people where they can find this book. And, I don't know if you're on social media or not, but where they can follow your work that you're doing. If you would share that, I think that would be great.
Yes, so I am on Instagram. So Gabrielle Oliveira, you can find me there on Instagram. I'm also at my website, which is my name, gabrielleoliveira.com. And then you can, there information there about when I'll be giving talks or different things. And for the book, I always recommend if you can order at your independent bookstore. That's usually my recommendation. That means it's going to take a little time. They may have to order in or something. But if not, you can always order on any of, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of those, or go straight to the press, Stanford University press, and order straight from them as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle. I really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Thank you for all that you do, Pam. I appreciate it.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Gabrielle Oliveira for coming on the show to talk about her book, Now We Are Here. This book really expanded the picture I had of migrant families. I'll put links to Now We Are Here and Gabrielle's Instagram account in the show notes. If you want to reach me, you can find me at arthealsallwoundspodcast.com. I'm not on social media at the moment, so if you know someone who'd appreciate this show, please share. Thanks for listening. The music you've heard in this podcast was by Quetzal and Lobo Loco.